Reformation, reaction, new dogmatisms, new pragmatisms. Europe stirred, especially its cities. Printing spread new ideas, and artists turned to secular subjects and everyday life. The rise of the middle classes, this time on the Western tradition.
And now UCLA professor Eugene Weber's continuing journey through the history of Western civilization.
Last time we began to explore the great religious and political changes of the 16th century, which went hand in hand with the urban activities and the rise of urban social groups that nowadays we describe as bourgeois. Now, these burghers were not, for the most part, unscrupulous adventurers, fortune hunters, nouveaux riches who had popped up out of nothing through their rackets, through their speculations. There were some of those, of course, but on the whole, the bourgeois were not solely concerned with gain. Many of them got on by hard and patient labor, and many had a kind of seriousness, a need and respect for morality and for knowledge that made them accumulate books about the lives of the saints in their libraries, that made them devote half their wills to invocations to God and to the saints, and bequests to pious causes. And even sometimes it led them to retire at an early age and devote their time to study and prayer.
The bourgeois were also realists in a hard world, but their realism did not exclude a strong sense of duty and a strong need of religious certainty and comfort. The question then became what kind of certainty, because as the medieval order collapsed, the old certainties did not suffice anymore. Remember that the bourgeois were merchants, traders, travelers, who saw and compared a lot of people and a lot of places, and who drew from this experience a sense of relativity, of relative values. And because they dealt in quantity and money and material things, they also developed a sense of precision, of exactness, above all perhaps of practical solutions. They read the ancients and drew from them the idea of a religion that was clear and reasonable and reasonably human. Now, what kind of religion did the official church have to offer? Simple folk had their saints and hellfire. More educated people were offered church services that were either perfunctory, purely formalistic, and when they looked beyond, they found theologians who wrote books for other theologians. This was part of the trouble. In some ways, the Protestant Reformation was less a revolt against corruption than against cliquishness and condescension. The basic argument of the theologians was that dogma was beyond the grasp of reason, and therefore the faithful should accept this fact and accept the dogma without trying to understand it. There was a dryness here, a drought of the spirit that the reformers rose against as much as they rose against the superstitions fed to the masses. When Luther said, Juristen böse Christen, lawmen are bad Christians, He was talking about a kind of religious sterility in the church, formalized and legalized. This was not the sort of theology that was suited to the new men of the cities who grew in number and importance, who developed a new group consciousness, and who developed a taste for clarity and lucidity by reading the ancients and by reading humanists like Erasmus. So there was bound to be a clash between the aspirations of the bourgeoisie, which wanted to reconcile its action and its faith, and the status quo of an anachronistic church.
Now, I don't want to make my explanation too narrow. No single interpretation can ever be valid, and there is no exclusive relation between the Reformation and the rise of the bourgeoisie. For one thing, the 16th century bourgeoisie were not the dominant social group they became in the 19th century. Peasants and nobles were also spiritually ill at ease and discontented. But the church had always to contend with heretics or potential heretics, most of them concerned with bringing people closer to salvation and to God. It had always managed to handle these heretics by absorbing them or by burning them. At this time, the church had lost its touch. And if that happened, it was at least partly connected with this burgher-related spirit that I've described.
The gap between the church and the bourgeoisie grew wider every day. The more so because most of the clergy, especially the theologians, didn't know and didn't much care about the concerns of their time. They lived among themselves. They closed their eyes to everything but internal church affairs. And even those clergy who realized that the church did need to change thought that they could save religion simply by reforming the clergy and the church machinery, a kind of party purge. Improve the education of the clergy, reform its discipline, and everything would be okay.
Perhaps the clergy were right, but I think they missed the point at issue. The point on which the Reformation struggle really seems to have started, which is the issue of authority. The old men and the establishment in general envisioned reform as merely making adjustments to the repository of authority, the clergy. And they thought that this would be sufficient. The new men, however, wanted them to demonstrate the right and the nature of authority itself. This was the basic difference out of which the Reformation came. And the Reformation essentially offered the bourgeois two things above all others that the church had not done. One, that the Bible be written not in Latin, but in the vulgar tongue, so that everybody could read it. And two, the idea of justification by faith. The idea that faith alone justifies and saves the believer, not the myriad rituals and practices that lay at the core of the church.
These ideas were not plucked out of the air by Martin Luther in 1517 or by John Calvin, the French theologian and reformer who was banished from Paris in 1528 for his Protestant teachings. The ideas had been there before, in a mood, in a widespread yearning. These in turn led to new translations of the Bible in the vernacular, which were then placed in the hands of the faithful without cuts or reservations or previous censorship by some body of official interpreters, and this gave the people of the time two novelties. First, a living human God, and second, a radical transformation of the whole notion of priesthood. People wanted to get nearer to God, nearer to Christ, but they felt that they were being held off, kept away for lack of an opportunity to engage in a direct dialogue between the believer and his Redeemer. This direct dialogue would be facilitated, however, if the Bible was written in your own language, so you could read it yourself in your own home. But that would make it a dialogue from which the priest was henceforth absent, or at least subordinated, unwanted, sometimes even resented. The fact is that more and more, these burghers who raised themselves to the top by personal effort, by their own merits and gifts, who fought for advancement and achieved successes that they knew they owed only to themselves, these men did not want priestly mediation or intercession. They were still deferential to their social or spiritual betters, but they had a new pride and a new sense of responsibility which encouraged them to question most authorities except the very highest. Another development arising from the bourgeois spirit of the time was the new glorification of manual labor. And this, too, affected the new men's attitude towards the church. For hundreds and thousands of years, the ideal of man had been a sort of unproductive idleness to be abandoned only for destructive or formal or ritual purposes. Most people earned their living by the sweat of their brow, but that's because they had to. To labor was vulgar. Even Christianity, which put prayer and meditation above work and the other pursuits of the world, even Christianity embraced this view. But in the 16th century, Catholics like Rabelais and Protestants like Calvin began to sing another tune, and the lyrics said, "He who doesn't work doesn't deserve to eat." They saw very little piety in the useless lives of monks who prayed but didn't contribute anything concrete to the welfare of their fellow men. And so now monks and priests were envisaged as parasites, avoiding the responsibilities of the world and doing nobody any good, least of all themselves. Moreover, you don't need monks and priests if you have your Bible and you can read it. You've got eternal God on one hand, and you, the believer, on the other, who can receive God's message without any intermediary, who can capture this message directly through the scriptures, which are quite literally the Word of God. There is a profound and subversive logic in Martin Luther, who translated the Bible into this German edition and who asserted every Christian is a priest, every believer is his own priest.
The other very important gift the Reformation furnished to the bourgeoisie was the idea that faith alone justifies and saves the believer. And the thing to realize here is that the formula of justification by faith, for which so many people accepted persecution and death, was not so much a theological formula as a psychological formula. It offered two things. First of all, it attacked the prevalent Catholic mystique of justification by works, not just good works like founding chantries, not just payment, but also personal mortification, the punishment of the body, the rejection of active life, and so on. Now, this entire value system, which we have seen triumph with the rise of Christianity and monasticism after Mediterranean civilization collapsed 10 or 12 centuries before, this was now rejected by the Reformation in a radical re-evaluation of life, the world, the body, and by a re-evaluation of activity in all these spheres. Activity to the greater glory of God, of course, but also to the glory and the use of the things that God created, which should not be scorned or set aside too lightly. And even when some Protestants became Puritans, tending to renounce or to reject the pleasures of life and of the flesh, a stance which came rather close to a certain Catholic tradition of sainthood, the Puritans still represented a different personality type. Catholics and Protestants might still agree that the world was a terrible place and all that counted was salvation. But Catholics in general preferred to be reassured by a paternalistic church that offered access or at least intercession for salvation, whereas Protestants insisted that you have to forge your own salvation. You have to make it on your own. And you can see how this fitted perfectly with the new urban spirit of enterprise and pragmatism.
Justification by faith also abolished the terrible fear that you might die unshriven, unabsolved by a priest of all the sins that imperiled your salvation. And it abolished the cult of the dead, all the prayers and practices that had lain at the heart of Christian sensibility, as of so many other religions. So in the new Protestant societies, the endowed masses and chantries and all the activities and monuments that had funneled money away from secular consumption and secular investment, all these came to an end. The house of the Lord shed its splendors for sobriety, the soberness that fits the sober, serious temper of burghers and bankers and scholars who admired Luther for daring to stand up before the emperor himself and to insist on his right to obey his own judgment and his own conscience. After all, the bourgeois also wanted to assert their freedom of conscience, their independence, and reformers like Luther encouraged this. They told the Christian to do his business with God directly without the mediation of priests, to forget saints and relics and any kind of interference in the crucial business of salvation, to open his Bible and read for himself without a priestly interpreter. And in all this, printing was a crucial factor because it provided the Bibles for new model Christians and because it also made the visual propaganda of paintings and sculptures in church seem unnecessary, superfluous. Protestants could afford to be iconoclasts because they were people of the book. And Protestantism was a religion of the book. So the visual arts of Protestants were going to focus not on religious subjects, but on secular ones, on everyday life, on landscapes, on portraits. This is a portrait, a self-portrait of Hieronymus Bosch, a mystical and moralistic painter who died just before Luther nailed his thesis to the Wittenberg chapel door. The paintings of Bosch are eerie. They are like grotesque hallucinations, nightmares of temptation, the fall, and punishment in and beyond a profoundly corrupt world. There is no room in Bosch's works for normal, untroubled people, or at least his extraordinary, ordinary people exist only in terms of spiritual categories like temptation, damnation, salvation. By the time of Peter Bruegel, who lived from 1525 to 1569 and who was a younger contemporary of John Calvin, things had changed quite radically. Bruegel's paintings are mostly landscapes or scenes of peasant life. Bruegel was influenced by Bosch, as most northern painters were at that time, but Bruegel was a humanist. He was didactic, moralizing, and often grotesque, but where Bosch was catastrophic, Bruegel was satirical. He was as Christian as Bosch, and he was passionate in his own way, but his religious ideas were common sense ideas, rational and ethical. He denounced avarice and greed, he ridiculed pretentiousness, and he parodied ceremonies, including religious ceremonies. Bruegel was interested in nature and in real people. Indeed, in very ordinary people, peasants and the poor, who hardly ever attracted anybody's attention before. He did not sweeten or glorify or poeticize these people, but painted them warts and all, which really made him the first modern painter and an example of the forces at work in these times. On the other hand, it's interesting to note that Bruegel's major patron was a cardinal, and that the Catholic Habsburg princes who governed Belgium for Philip II so admired Bruegel's work that the best place to see his paintings today is the Court Museum in Vienna. Even so, we know that on his deathbed, Bruegel told his wife to burn all his remaining paintings, lest she should get into trouble. So even an artist with high protectors had reason to worry. And we have to bear this in mind when we think of the Catholic counteroffensive, the counter-Reformation, which set out to clean and reform the Church, as well as fight and defeat the Protestant enemy. Beginning in 1545, a church council, the Council of Trent, reaffirmed the authority of the Church, of tradition, and of the Church hierarchy. The Inquisition, the special tribunal for identifying and punishing heresy, was also refurbished, and the first thing it did was to attack on the printing front. The first index of prohibited books appeared in 1559, books better burnt than read, and there would be a catechism, a book of questions and answers outlining principles of right belief for all Catholic Christians, and there would be an approved Bible, the Vulgate, written in Latin. There was also the New Society of Jesus, founded by a Spanish knight, Ignatius Loyola, who lived from 1491 to 1556. Loyola was fascinated by chivalric ideals and treated the service of God as a kind of holy knighthood. The Jesuit was an up-to-date version of the Christian athlete, highly trained on the intellectual plane as well as on the spiritual, flexible, adaptable, disciplined, and self-disciplined, literate, cultivated, subject to a strong central authority. The Jesuits were ready to compete with Protestant enterprise on the educational front, in missionary enterprise, and religious fervor.
And their achievements in all these realms were going to be quite remarkable. So the Counter-Reformation was a very powerful force, and the battle lines were drawn. But from this point on, there was going to be choice within Western culture. There was going to be competition. There were going to be battles of books as well as of soldiers. Three of the great elements of modern Western civilization, gunpowder, printing, and the Protestant religion, had come together. We shall see just how explosive the mixture could be in the programs to come.